I never imagined my life could split into two halves with such a brutal cut, before the inheritance and after it. Before, I was just Elaine Matthews, 28 years old, quietly working, living, and grieving the woman who had been the anchor of my entire world. After, I became Elaine the millionaire, the girl who suddenly had everything, and yet felt more hollow and terrified than she had ever been. It was only yesterday when I sat in the echoing conference room of my aunt's attorney, still in mourning black, my fingers trembling against the polished oak table. Harold Thompson, her lawyer of 30 years, read through pages of her will in his calm, measured voice. Each sentence seemed to lift me higher into a dizzying place I couldn't breathe in. $2 million in liquid assets, a Victorian mansion on Lakeview Drive, full ownership of Hughes Home Collections, her chain of home decor boutiques, valued at 12 million, and all her investments, jewelry, artwork, automobiles, everything. It was a tidal wave of wealth and responsibility I hadn't prepared for. But beneath the numbers, beneath the shock, was the ache. I wasn't celebrating, I was mourning. My aunt, Margaret Hughes, had been more than family. She had been my rescuer, my guardian, my strict teacher, my only constant. She was the woman who showed me that love doesn't need to be spoken if it's proven every single day. She had shaped me from a broken, abandoned child into a woman with steel in her spine. And now she was gone. I thought the worst part of that morning was hearing her estate described in clinical, legal language, like her whole life could be compressed into a list of assets and liabilities. I thought grief was my only companion. But then the door opened. They walked in. My parents. The same mother and father who had vanished when I was 13, who had abandoned me with a note of 16 words, who had let me cry myself to sleep, waiting for a phone call that never came. My body went rigid. My mind felt like someone had splintered a glass pane inside it. 15 years without them, 15 years of silence, and suddenly they were here, walking into the attorney's office with false smiles, as if we were a family reunited after a vacation, not a crime scene of betrayal. Elaine, my mother said, her voice syrupy, too sweet to be real. We are your guardians. Guardians. The words sliced through me like a razor. Guardian, and the smug look on their faces drained to a pale ghostliness. In that moment, I realized something. This story wasn't just about inheritance. It wasn't just about money or property. It was about the reckoning of 15 years. The truth was coming for them, and I, their abandoned daughter, was its vessel. But I must take you back, because the weight of this moment, the inheritance, the shock, the bitter reunion, can only be understood if you know where it all began. If you know the life I had before the fortune, before the reckoning, if you know the girl they left behind. And so let me rewind the clock. Let me tell you about the little apartment, the movie nights, the laughter that cracked into silence, the note on the kitchen counter. Let me tell you how I lost everything, so you understand why what came next was both devastating and inevitable. Because this story, my story, is not only about wealth gained, it is about wounds reopened, masks ripped off, and a revenge written not with fire and fury, but with the cold ink of justice and truth. And it all began the day my parents decided that I wasn't worth staying for. The day my parents abandoned me is carved into my memory like a scar that refuses to fade. I was 13 years old, a girl who still believed that parents, no matter how flawed, always stayed. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in October, cold enough that frost painted the edges of our apartment windows. I woke late, confused by the silence. Normally, my mother would tap softly on my bedroom door, reminding me not to miss school. But that morning, no knock came. The air in the apartment felt wrong, too still, too empty. I pushed the door open and noticed something strange. Their bedroom door stood wide open. My mother always kept it closed during her bad days. I stepped closer, heart thudding. The closet was half empty, drawers pulled out, only a few socks left behind. A sense of dread prickled down my spine. In the kitchen, I found it. A single sheet of paper folded neatly on the counter. My mother's handwriting, familiar and yet foreign in its finality. Elaine, we cannot do this anymore. Your Aunt Margaret will take care of you. We are sorry. 16 words. That was the sum of my parents' love, the explanation for the shattering of my childhood. 16 words to sever me from the two people I trusted most. I dialed my mother's cell again and again, each unanswered ring sinking me deeper into panic. My father's number, already disconnected. His suspicious eyes made me feel smaller, exposed. He muttered about social services, and terror gripped me. Foster care. Being sent away to strangers. I wasn't ready for that. By the third day, I broke. I told my school counselor everything. That's how Child Protective Services got involved. That's how Miss Dawson, the social worker, came into my life. She had kind eyes, the kind that made me feel, for just a moment, that I wasn't invisible. She made calls, pulled strings, and somehow reached my Aunt Margaret, the woman I barely knew, my father's older sister, the one they always whispered about disapprovingly. That phone call changed everything. I still remember the knock on the door the next morning. A sleek black car idled outside, gleaming like it didn't belong in our crumbling neighborhood. And there she was, Margaret Hughes, in a grey suit, pearls around her neck, silver hair pulled into a severe bun. She didn't hug me. She didn't weep or apologize for my parents. She simply said, "Pack what you can carry. The rest can be shipped later." Her voice was clipped but not unkind. That was my introduction to the woman who would become my savior. But before that rescue, I had already been marked. Abandonment does that to you. It tells you you're not enough, that no matter how hard you try, people can still walk away. That wound never really closed, not even years later when I wore suits and spoke in boardrooms. At 13, though, all I knew was this: my parents had left, and the world as I knew it had ended. What I didn't know then was that this was just the first tragedy, the beginning of a story that would bend and twist into a reckoning none of us could have predicted. Because sometimes life doesn't just break you once, it waits and then it strikes again, just when you think you've started to heal. And For me, the real betrayals, the ones that would set the stage for my revenge, were only beginning. When people hear the word family, they imagine warmth, holidays, laughter, unconditional love. But for me, the word became synonymous with danger, disappointment, and deception. To understand why, you need to know who my parents really were before they walked out of my life. My father, Richard Matthews, was once charming in that easy salesman way. He worked at a car dealership, always ready with a smile, a pat on the back, and a promise that felt like sunshine, even when it was hollow. To strangers, he was likable. To me, he was dad. She smelled of chalk and apple scented lotion, and she always made Christmas feel magical. She used to sing while cooking cinnamon rolls on Christmas morning. But as Dad's gambling escalated, she changed. The brightness in her eyes dimmed. She stayed in bed with the curtains drawn, sometimes for days. She would snap at me for asking about groceries, then cry when she thought I wasn't looking. Her depression swallowed her whole, leaving her a shell of the mother I had known. I didn't understand then, but I can see it now. They were unraveling, each in their own way. My father chasing illusions of quick wealth, my mother collapsing under despair. But even in their worst moments, I never expected abandonment. And then there was my aunt, Margaret Hughes, my father's older sister. She was everything they weren't: disciplined, successful, relentless. She took a modest inheritance and built an empire of boutique home decor stores across 3 states. She never married, never had children, and according to my parents, never approved of their choices. To me, she was a stranger. I had only met her twice, both times feeling like I was under the scrutiny of a queen who found me lacking. I never could have guessed she would become my savior. Looking back, it's almost poetic. My parents' failures created the perfect storm for Margaret to step in. But at the time, all I knew was that the people who were supposed to love me the most had vanished. The truth is, betrayal doesn't arrive in a single moment. It builds. It begins with little lies. My father saying he'd quit gambling. My mother saying she was fine. It escalates, with secrets whispered behind closed doors, arguments hushed when I walked by. It culminates in silence, in an empty apartment, in a note that severs a child from her family. And yet, even after all of it, some part of me still longed for them, still wondered if maybe they had a reason, a secret tragedy, something that explained the unexplainable. That longing became a weakness they would later exploit. I used to picture their faces in crowds, convincing myself I saw them at malls or in passing cars. My heart leapt at shadows, convinced they would come back. That's the thing about abandonment. It wires you to hope even when you shouldn't. So when they finally did return, 15 years later, in that attorney's office, they didn't just bring shock. They resurrected every wound, every unanswered question, every ghost of a little girl who had once begged for their love. But their return wasn't about love, it was about money. And the masks they wore, their fake smiles, their counterfeit tenderness, would soon slip, revealing who they truly were. That revelation was coming, but before I could face it, I had to tell you about the years that followed their departure. The years where I hit rock bottom. Rock bottom isn't a single moment, it's a series of them, piling one after the other until you're buried under the weight of despair. For me, it began the night after my parents vanished. I lay curled on the couch with a box of cereal beside me, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. Every creak of the apartment made me jump, convinced they were coming back. But they didn't. By the second day, hunger gnawed at me, but fear gnawed harder. I didn't want anyone to know they had left me. What if social services took me away? What if they sent me to strangers? I clung to the idea that hiding my pain would make them return faster, as if they might walk back in and reward me for being strong. But reality is crueler than fantasies. By the third day, when the landlord knocked, suspicion dripping from his voice, I knew the secret couldn't be kept. His words, "I'll have to call social services," were like a sentence being passed. That's when I broke. I told my school counselor, who called in the professionals. Still, those days before rescue remain etched into me. The loneliness was suffocating. I would stare at the ceiling, trying to recall every detail of their faces, terrified I would forget. My mother's laugh, my father's whistle when he cooked breakfast. It all felt like it was evaporating, and I couldn't hold on to it. I kept thinking, if I forget them, who am I? When Aunt Margaret finally arrived, sleek car gleaming, heels clicking on the worn apartment floor, she didn't find a girl with tears in her eyes. She found a hollowed out shell of one. I had cried so much in those 3 days that I thought there were no tears left. Instead, there was only numbness. "Pack what you can," she said. Her voice was steady, firm, like the strike of a gavel. I obeyed, moving through the motions as if underwater. One suitcase, a few photo albums, books, clothes worn thin. Everything else could rot in that apartment. The drive to her estate was 3 hours long, and silence pressed down on me the whole way. She asked if I was hungry, if I needed a restroom, but she didn't ask about my parents. Maybe she already knew I couldn't answer. Maybe she already understood that silence was my only protection. Rock bottom didn't end when I moved into her mansion. If anything, the vastness of the house deepened it. My bedroom was larger than our entire apartment, with velvet curtains and a four-poster bed that felt more like a stage prop than a place to sleep. I lay awake at night, dwarfed by the adults make choices that children can't control. But I couldn't believe her. Deep down I thought maybe if I had been better, if I had cleaned more, studied harder, smiled wider, they would have stayed. Guilt became my shadow, following me everywhere. The lowest point came months later. It was my 14th birthday. I sat at the dining table Margaret had meticulously set, cake in front of me, candles flickering. She watched from across the table, expectant but restrained, as if unsure what this moment required of her. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't blow out the candles, because the one wish I wanted was impossible. I burst into tears, sobbing uncontrollably, my chest heaving with years of pain compressed into minutes. Margaret didn't rush to comfort me. She didn't hug me or shush me. She simply slid a handkerchief across the table, placed it near me, and sat in silence until my sobs slowed. That moment, more than any therapy session, taught me something. Sometimes presence mattered more than words. Sometimes strength wasn't about fixing, it was about staying. That night, I realized something else too. I could keep falling into the pit of abandonment forever, or I could start climbing. My parents had left me broken, but they hadn't destroyed me. Margaret's steady presence, unyielding, unwavering, was the rope thrown into that pit. It was up to me to grab it. Rock bottom wasn't the end of my story, it was the foundation. Because once you've been stripped of everything, there's a kind of freedom in what's left. You can rebuild yourself piece by jagged piece into something stronger than before. And that's exactly what I did. Transformation doesn't happen in a single day. It's not like a light switch you flip on after the darkness. For me, it was a long, grueling climb, one that Aunt Margaret orchestrated with a precision that, at times, felt merciless, but ultimately saved me. She didn't coddle me. She didn't whisper sweet lies about how everything would be okay. Instead, she gave me rules, dozens of them. Breakfast at 7 sharp, beds made before school, no shoes on the hardwood floors, piano practice for an hour daily, homework at a desk, never on the couch. Dinner conversations had to include a personal achievement and a discussion of current events. At first, I rebelled. I was angry, lost, and secretly hoped if I pushed her hard enough, she would send me away. I broke rules deliberately, skipped piano practice, dragged my feet to breakfast, left my bed messy. Each time, her response was consistent, never cruel but never soft. Late to breakfast, the kitchen was closed. Homework incomplete, no weekend outings. Caught sneaking television on a school night. The set was locked in the cabinet. I expected rage. Margaret also believed in education with a fervour that bordered on religious. When she saw that my public school was failing me, she transferred me to Westfield Academy, a private school filled with polished hallways and polished students who seemed worlds ahead of me. I was a charity case in their eyes, the awkward girl with second-hand clothes, a scholarship, and a tragic backstory whispered about during lunch breaks. The first year was brutal. I stayed up late, cramming, tears soaking my geometry notes. I failed tests, stumbled through presentations, and watched my peers glide effortlessly while I drowned. One night, I sobbed at the dining room table, crumpling my assignments. Margaret didn't comfort me with false hope. She simply said, "You can quit or you can adapt, but I don't invest in lost causes." It wasn't the gentle encouragement I craved, but it struck something in me. I refused to be a lost cause. I found a peer tutor, created study groups, and clawed my way onto the honor roll by junior year. The pride I saw flicker in Margaret's eyes, even if she masked it with a simple nod, was enough to keep me going. By the time college applications rolled around, I wasn't the broken girl abandoned in an empty apartment. I was a young woman with ambition sharpened by hardship. We clashed over college, of course. I wanted a state school close to friends, familiar. She pushed for prestigious universities, ones that terrified me. Our biggest fight erupted then. I accused her of controlling my life. She accused me of wasting potential. In the heat of that battle, she revealed truths about my parents I had never known. That my father had once been brilliant but chained to poverty. That my mother had promise but no support. She was trying to break the cycle, she said, to give me what they never had. Her words rattled me. For the first time, I realized her cold determination wasn't cruelty, it was desperation, her way of protecting me from repeating their mistakes. I applied to 7 schools, got into 5, chose Northwestern University, where I studied business and marketing. It was there that I discovered my talent for strategy and design, skills that blended seamlessly with the financial acumen Margaret had instilled in me. Summers I interned at her company, watching her maneuver through negotiations with a surgeon's precision. Our relationship evolved. Physical distance gave space for emotional closeness. Sunday phone calls turned warmer. Sometimes we even laughed. When I graduated with honors, she shook my hand firmly, but the pride shining in her eyes told me everything words never could. I returned to work at her company. I stopped seeing myself as the abandoned girl. I was no longer defined by what I had lost. I was defined by what I had built. Yet, even in my strongest moments, the wound lingered. I still wondered about my parents, still scanned faces in crowds, still carried that gnawing question, why did they leave me? And perhaps that's why, years later, when they reappeared, I wasn't ready. I thought I was. I thought transformation had armored me. But revenge isn't born in a vacuum. It's born when old wounds are ripped open again, when ghosts return in the flesh, demanding power they forfeited long ago. And when my parents walked back into my life, smiling as if no time had passed, I realized the journey of transformation wasn't over. It was only preparing me for the final test. I had changed, but no one knew it yet. That was my greatest weapon, the element of silence, of secrecy. When Aunt Margaret passed and the news of my inheritance spread, I didn't tell the world how much I had grown under her tutelage. I didn't flaunt my degrees, my years running her marketing division, or the late nights spent at her side learning every detail of the company she built. Instead, I let everyone assume I was just the girl who had been given everything. I wore grief like armor, and behind it I sharpened myself. In the weeks after her funeral, I returned to the mansion that was now legally mine. I walked its long corridors at night, the hardwood floors creaking under my feet, feeling the weight of her presence still lingering. I sat in her study, surrounded by shelves of ledgers, contracts, and blueprints of expansion plans she hadn't lived to see. And in that silence, I began preparing, because something inside me whispered that my parents would return. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. 15 years of silence wasn't going to end with a kind letter of apology. No, they would come back when there was something to gain. And now, with millions in assets, a thriving company, and a sprawling estate under my name, I was the jackpot. So I prepared in secret. I combed through Margaret's files, learning every legal safeguard she had put in place. I met with Harold Thompson late at night, reviewing documents that proved not only my inheritance, but also the adoption papers Margaret had filed when I was 16. She hadn't told me then, fearing it might feel like erasing my parents. But she had quietly secured me with the strongest shield possible. I found more than paperwork in those files. I found records of their past, photographs of my father in casino lobbies, my mother working as a cocktail waitress, reports of debts, evictions, even attempts to extort Margaret years earlier. I was a general plotting the quiet war to come. When the will reading came, I dressed in a navy suit Margaret would have approved of. My face was composed, my voice calm. Inside, my heart thundered with anticipation. And then it happened. The door opened. My parents walked in. For a moment, I wanted to scream, to weep, to collapse into the arms of the people I had longed for as a child. But the years had hardened me. Instead, I studied them like opponents across a negotiation table. My father, heavier, grayer, shoulders slumped beneath invisible debts. My mother, thin, eyes shadowed, smile stretched tight like a mask. They looked smaller than I remembered, as if life itself had shrunk them down. And still, they had the audacity to smile, to call themselves my guardians. They didn't know who I had become. They still saw the broken 13-year-old they left behind, the girl desperate for approval. They didn't see the woman who had spent 15 years under Margaret's iron discipline, who had survived grief, who had already prepared every counterattack before they even opened their mouths. Their mistake was assuming they held power. Mine was letting them believe it. That day in the attorney's office, I said little. I let their words hang in the air, sweet with false affection, heavy with entitlement. I let them believe I was caught off guard, stunned, vulnerable. All the while, I knew something they didn't. The papers locked in Thompson's desk, the letters Margaret left me, the clause in her will that would disinherit me entirely if I ever yielded to their threats. I had already won before the battle began. But revenge, true revenge, isn't about winning once. It's about revealing the truth so thoroughly, so unmistakably, that the offenders are left with nothing, not even the lies they clung to. So I kept silent. I let them arrange a dinner. I let them make their appeals, their subtle requests, their inevitable demands, and all the while I listened, observed, collected every slip of the mask. This was no longer the helpless girl abandoned in an empty apartment. This was the secret heir returned, armed with truth, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when that moment came, it would not just expose them, it would break them. The invitation to dinner came almost as soon as the will reading ended. My parents, with their feigned tenderness, suggested it like a casual family reunion. "Let's catch up properly," my mother said, her smile stretching too wide, trembling at the corners. My father added, "We could meet before tomorrow's legal discussion, just the three of us." And I needed witnesses. When I arrived, they were already seated, faces brightening, as if I were a long-lost friend, rather than the daughter they had abandoned. My father stood, pulling out my chair with exaggerated courtesy. My mother's perfume hit me as she leaned in for a hug. I didn't return it. "We ordered a bottle of Pinot Noir," my father announced, as if he were treating me. "Your mother always enjoyed it." "I don't drink wine," I replied evenly, requesting water instead. A small boundary, but necessary. I wasn't here as their child. I was here as their equal, or rather, their judge. The first 20 minutes were filled with small talk so stilted it scraped against my nerves. They asked about my education, my job, my friends. I gave them clipped, factual answers. Each time I looked into their faces, I searched for the parents I had once loved. All I saw were actors reading from a poorly written script. Then came the pivot, my mother's hand stretched across the table, fingertips grazing mine, but I kept my hands wrapped around my water glass. "We owe you an explanation," she began. My father leaned in, his voice soft with practiced regret. He spoke of gambling debts, of dangerous people he owed money to. He admitted he had been reckless, but claimed he'd been clean for 8 years now. My mother added her struggle with depression, how she believed I would be better off with Aunt Margaret. Their words dripped with sorrow, with carefully rehearsed remorse. For a moment, I wanted to believe them. For a moment, the little girl inside me stirred, desperate for something, anything that resembled love. But then came the slip. My father twirled pasta around his fork and said, "Vivian did well by you, better than we could have, and now she's left you set for life. The house alone must be worth 2 million." The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Suddenly, It wasn't about regret, it was about numbers. My mother chimed in, her tone casual but sharp. And the business, of course. It's overwhelming for someone your age. I sat back, letting the silence stretch. They leaned forward, mistaking my quiet for hesitation. We could help, my father offered, voice soothing, almost paternal. You've got responsibility now, things you might not understand, taxes, legal issues, business strategies. We could guide you. I tilted my head. Guide me or control me? The birthdays you missed? The nightmares? What's the price tag on those? They didn't answer. They couldn't. Instead, they leaned into their rehearsed lines again. Family, forgiveness, fresh starts. My father even invoked blood. We're your parents, Elaine. Blood means something. I thought of Margaret, who had never once called me her daughter, but had shown up every single day. Yes, I said softly. Blood means something, but actions mean more. The rest of the dinner was a carousel of manipulation. They dangled regret like bait, switched to financial hints, circled back to love. By dessert, they had suggested I hire them at the company, perhaps with generous salaries. My mother hugged me again as we parted, whispering, "Think about what family really means, sweetheart. We all make mistakes." I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. The performance I had just witnessed wasn't reconciliation, it was a transaction. But they didn't know the depth of the trap they had walked into, because while they were calculating how to siphon from me, I already had every document, every record, every letter from Margaret that proved exactly who they were. They thought they were playing me. They had no idea the game had already been decided. The next morning, I walked into Harold Thompson's office with a folder under my arm and a storm in my chest. My parents were already there, seated beside a man with slicked back hair who introduced himself as Gerald Hoffman, their attorney. Of course they had one. Of course they thought this was a battle they could win. I sat across from them, calm on the surface, boiling underneath. Thompson entered, carrying several thick files, his assistant wheeling in a cart stacked with documents. The room didn't feel like a family meeting, it felt like a courtroom. "Before we begin," Thompson said, adjusting his glasses, "there seems to be some confusion about legal status. I'll clarify the history." He opened the first file. When Elaine came into Miss Hughes's care, the court established temporary guardianship. Multiple attempts were made to contact both of you about permanent arrangements. All failed. My mother frowned, her lips pinched. We were moving a lot. Things were complicated. Thompson ignored the excuse. After 6 months of failed contact, the court scheduled a hearing. Notices were sent to your last known addresses, published in the appropriate journals. No response. However, someone claiming to represent you appeared, presenting affidavits consenting to guardianship transfer. "We never signed anything," my father snapped. "Those must be forgeries." Thompson slid another document forward. "Miss Hughes suspected as much. She hired a private investigator. The report shows Mr. Matthews frequenting casinos in Nevada during this period. Photographs confirm it. Mrs. Matthews was employed as a cocktail waitress at those same casinos. When approached about Elaine, you both explicitly confirmed your desire to terminate parental responsibilities." The blood drained from my mother's face. My father shifted in his seat, rage simmering. "And," Thompson continued, his voice steady as steel, "the investigator documented a payment of $15,000 from the man who submitted the affidavits to Mr. Matthews the very next day." "That was unrelated business," my father barked, but the words fell flat. I glanced at them. Two people who had abandoned me for money, then sold their parental rights for more. And now here they were, trying to take what Margaret had left me. But Thompson wasn't finished. He pulled out a sealed envelope. Miss Hughes anticipated this exact situation. She left a letter for Elaine. My breath caught as I unfolded the pages, Margaret's precise handwriting staring back at me. I began to read aloud. My dearest Elaine, if you are reading this, it means I am gone and your parents have suddenly reappeared. This is not a coincidence. Over the years, they attempted to extort me multiple times, using you as leverage. 6 months after you came to me, your father demanded 50,000 to avoid challenging custody. I paid, fearing the trauma of a battle. 3 years later, he returned for more. I refused. When you turned 16, your mother called, claiming she had cancer and needed treatment money. My investigator confirmed this was false. When you were accepted to college, they attempted to obtain your email and demanded tuition money. Each time, I shielded you. Tears blurred my eyes, but I pressed on. What I never told you is this: I legally adopted you at 16. I kept your surname, hoping reconciliation might someday be possible. But know this: legally, emotionally, you are my daughter. They have no claim to you, nor to your inheritance. If they attempt to challenge, my will stipulates that everything transfers to a charitable foundation, leaving them nothing. The silence in the room was deafening. I looked up from the letter to see my parents' faces crumble. Thompson slid adoption papers across the table. Stamped, signed, irrefutable. Their attorney leaned in to whisper, his face pale. My father slammed his fist on the table. This is theft. She stole our daughter. No, I said, my voice trembling but clear. You gave me away for $15,000, and then you came back only. But the truth wasn't healing. It was a blade that cut clean through the lies, leaving only clarity. I wasn't theirs anymore. I never really had been. And for the first time, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt free. Their masks didn't just slip, they shattered. Watching my parents unravel in that office was like watching a play fall apart mid scene, actors forgetting their lines, the set collapsing behind them. The polished sorrow they had worn at dinner the night before dissolved into raw panic, anger, and desperation. My father's face turned red as he leaned forward, spitting words like venom. You think this changes anything? You think some papers erase blood? I am your father. I met his glare without flinching. You were my father. You made a choice. And now the law recognizes who truly raised me. Aunt Margaret was more of a parent than you ever were. My mother's sobs filled the room, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. She reached across the table, her voice breaking. Elaine, sweetheart, we thought about you every day. We called once, twice. We checked with social services. We were ashamed. We didn't know how to come back. Her words might have pierced me once. They might have broken me into pieces at 14, 15, even 16, but now they only rang hollow. Because if love had lived in them, it would have acted. It would have written letters. It would have sent birthday cards. It would have shown up. Love without action is just air. Harold Thompson spoke before I could. Mr. and Mrs. Matthews, Miss Hughes anticipated your objections. Not only is the adoption valid, but her will includes a no contest clause. Any legal challenge would forfeit the entire estate to charity. You stand to gain nothing. In fact, further pursuit may expose you to criminal liability given the documented history of extortion. Their attorney, Hoffman, shifted uncomfortably. He whispered harshly to them, urging restraint, but my father ignored him. This is fraud, a setup. You all conspired to cut us out. Thompson raised an eyebrow, calm as ever. You admitted only minutes ago that you accepted money during the guardianship transition. This office is under surveillance. I strongly suggest you reconsider your statements. The silence that followed was thick. My parents' bravado crumbled, leaving them smaller, desperate. My father's shoulders sagged. My mother clutched at my sleeve, her fingers trembling. We only wanted a chance to be a family again. Please, Elaine, don't do this. And there it was, the final manipulation, the last card they had left. Guilt. The plea of a mother, the appeal to the daughter they abandoned. I pulled my arm free. You had 15 years to be a family, 15 years to try, and you did nothing until there was money involved. That tells me everything. The color drained from their faces. Hoffman cleared his throat, closing his briefcase with finality. We're done here. Legally, you have no standing. Pursuing this further would only damage you. My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His eyes burned with rage, but beneath it, I saw something I had never seen before. Fear. Real, gnawing fear. The fear of someone who had finally lost. My mother lingered, her sobs softer now, tinged with regret. Elaine, she whispered, I love you. I always loved you. I shook my head. Then you should have stayed. Security escorted them out. Their footsteps echoed down the hall, fading until there was nothing left. Nothing but silence, and my own heartbeat, steady for the first time in years. I collapsed into the chair, exhausted, but strangely light. The ghosts that had haunted me were finally exposed under the brutal light of truth. For years, I had dreamed of this moment, imagined it with screaming confrontations, with dramatic reunions, with tears of reconciliation. But reality was cleaner, sharper. Not a messy tangle of forgiveness and regret, but a severing. They had lost their chance, and I had finally won, not just the inheritance, not just the protection of the law, but the clarity that their love had never been mine to lose. When the door closed behind my parents for the final time, I thought I might collapse under the weight of it all, but instead something extraordinary happened. The silence didn't feel empty anymore, it felt full, full of Margaret's voice reminding me that love is proven by showing up, full of the lessons she left behind in her meticulous rules, her business empire, her unwavering presence. In the weeks that followed, I settled into the mansion, not as a frightened heir, but as its rightful owner. I repainted rooms, opened curtains that had been drawn for too long, and let the house breathe again. It was no longer just Margaret's, it was ours, and now it was mine to protect. Every corner carried her imprint, from the velvet curtains in my room to the ledger books stacked neatly in the study. But I added my own touches, not to erase her, but to build upon her legacy. Running the business became my anchor. I modernized what Margaret had resisted, expanding our online presence, streamlining inventory. Hashtag at Meta, hashtag Bopont, nor sex 0.05, education, housing for those aging out of foster care. It was my way of transforming pain into purpose, of making sure no 13-year-old had to stare at an empty apartment and wonder why love had walked out the door. And still, the past lingered in strange ways. Months later, I received a letter from my mother. It wasn't a demand this time. It wasn't a plea for money. It was short, apologetic, trembling in its simplicity. She admitted she was wrong. She said she regretted leaving me every single day. For the first time, her words felt real. I didn't respond. Maybe I never will. Forgiveness is complicated. But I left the letter in my desk drawer, neither thrown away nor embraced. Some wounds aren't meant to close completely. What did close was the fantasy. For 15 years, I dreamed my parents would return and explain everything. That dream haunted me, broke me, shaped me, but the reality proved more valuable than the fantasy ever could. Reality showed me that their limitations were theirs, not mine. Reality freed me. And Margaret, my mother, in all the ways that mattered, had prepared me for this freedom. I found a second letter in her nightstand, written not as the shrewd businesswoman or strict guardian, but as the woman who finally admitted her heart. I love you, she wrote, not out of duty, but because of who you are. You are my daughter in every way that matters. That was the closure I never expected, not from the ones who left me, but from the one who stayed. 6 months later, I visited her grave with fresh flowers. The stone was elegant black granite, her name carved with dignity. Beneath it, I had one word added: Mother, because that's who she was. Not the woman who gave me life, but the woman who gave me everything else. As I stood there, I realized the inheritance she left me wasn't money or property or even the company. It was the knowledge that family isn't written in blood. It's written in consistency, in sacrifice, in the thousand quiet choices that prove love every day. My parents had given me life. Margaret had given me everything else. And now it was my turn to carry that legacy forward. Not as a victim of abandonment, but as a survivor, a builder, a daughter who finally understood what love truly meant. So when people ask me if I regret anything, I tell them this: pain carved me into who I am, betrayal forced me to grow, and revenge, true revenge, wasn't screaming or fighting or even winning in court. It was living well, it was thriving. It was showing them that the girl they threw away had become